بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. كحديث النهي عن بيع الولاء وعن هبته تفرد به عبد الله بن دينار عن ابن عمر، وقد ينفرد به راو عن ذلك المنفرد، كحديث شعب الإيمان تفرد به أبو صالح عن أبي هريرة، وتفرد به عبد الله بن دينار عن أبي صالح. وقد يستمر التفرد في جميع رواته أو أكثرهم، وفي مسند البزار والمعجم الأوسط للطبراني أمثلة كثيرة لذلك. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is explaining the two types of gharib narrations. So he commenced with the first type, and that is what we explained in the previous lesson. I will quickly give a summary of everything that we mentioned up until this point in point form. So the first point was that gharib and fard are synonyms. The next point, the first type of gharib is al-gharib al-Muṭlaq, and it could also be called al-fard al-Muṭlaq because they are both synonyms. So al-gharib al-Muṭlaq is where there is one narrator in the beginning of the sanad, at aslus sanad. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he is the first to confine al-gharib al-Muṭlaq to this meaning. The next point is that the text of Nuzha an-Naḍar makes it seem as if the singularity is in the link of the Sahaba. The next point is that during the lessons, the author, he explains that this refers to singularity in the link of the one who is narrating from the Sahabi, and that is the Tabi'i. The next point is that scholars who did not consider this explanation of the author, they assumed and they even insisted that he intends that the singularity is in a link of the Sahaba. The next point is that the commentators who were aware of the author's explanation, they understood that he intends the link of the Tabi'in. And the next point is that there are differences among scholars on the terminology to use if there is only one Sahabi who is transmitting the narration. But thereafter there are many other narrators in all other links. Now Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah presents an example of al-fard al-Muṭlaq. So in this paragraph he presents two examples. He says كحديث النهي عن بيع الولاء وعن هبته تفرد به عبد الله بن دينار عن ابن عمر. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he brings two examples. The first is where there is only one tabi'i, and in all other links there are many narrators. And the second example is where there is only one tabi'i, and from that one tabi'i there is only one student who quoted it. So the first example is singularity in the link of the tabi'i, كحديث النهي عن بيع الولاء وعن هبته, that like the hadith on the prohibition of selling wala and gifting wala, that Abdullah ibn Dinar is the only one who narrated it from Abdullah ibn Umar. So this here is the narration that comes in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. It's a muttafaq alayhi narration. Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahumullah, they both narrate with different students, or rather via different students of Abdullah ibn Dinar, and they quote عن عبد الله بن دينار عن ابن عمر أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم نهى عن بيع الولاء وعن هبته. After quoting this narration, Imam Muslim rahimahullah, he said الناس كلهم عيال على عبد الله بن دينار في هذا الحديث, that everyone, any person who wants this narration, then he will be dependent on Abdullah ibn Dinar, because Abdullah ibn Dinar is the only tabi'i who is narrating this hadith. So if you want this narration, it will have to go via Abdullah ibn Dinar. You cannot get it via any other tabi'i to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he mentioned in his commentary of Sahih al-Bukhari in Fath al-Bari, volume 12, page 43, وَقَدْ اشْتَهَرَ هَذَا الْحَدِيث عن عبد الله بن دينار حتى قال مسلم لما أخرجه في صحيحه الناس في هذا الحديث عيال عليه. that this narration has become so popular and so famous from Abdullah ibn Dinar that Imam Muslim rahimahullah said that any person who wants this narration, an-nasu fi hadha al-hadith ayalun alayhi, people are dependent on Abdullah ibn Dinar. On the next page, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah wrote, وقد اعتنى أبو نعيم الأصبهاني بجمع طرقه عن عبد الله بن دينار فأورده عن 35 نفسا ممن حدث به عن عبد الله بن دينار. That Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani rahimahullah, he gathered all the different turuq and he found 35 students who are narrating it from Abdullah ibn Dinar. So therefore, those students, if they then narrated it, you can see how their students would quote their teachers, and it will all then come back to Abdullah ibn Dinar. After narrating this narration, Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah, he mentioned, هذا حديث حسن صحيح لا نعرفه إلا من حديث عبد الله ibn Dinar عن ابن عمر. That we don't know of anyone else who narrated it besides Abdullah ibn Dinar from Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu anhu. And then he says, وَيُرْوَى عَنْ شُعْبَ قال, that Imam Shu'bah rahimahullah, he said, لَوَدِدْتُ أَنَّ عَبْدَ اللَّهِ ibn Dinar حين حدث بهذا الحديث أذن لي حتى كنت أقوم إليه فأقبل رأسه. That I would have loved to kiss his forehead once he narrated this to me, because he is the means of me getting this narration. Besides him, there is no other way that I could have got this narration. Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah then explains a mistake of someone who quoted this via another person from Abdullah ibn Umar. And interestingly, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he quoted that narration as support for this narration in Fathul Bari. So what would that mean? If this narration is support, it means now it's no more only Abdullah ibn Umar. It's no more only Abdullah ibn Dinar. So it means it is a Aziz narration. It's not even Gharib, leave alone being Al-Gharib al-Muṭlaq. But here in Nuzha an-Naḍar, he's mentioning it as a example of a Gharib al-Muṭlaq. So this here is just for the interest of those of you who are studying this book for the second time and those of you who completed a Dawrah. So in Fathul Bari, in volume 12 on page 43, he wrote, وصل رواية يحيى بن سليم ابن ماجه ولم ينفرد به يحيى بن سليم فقد تابعه أبو ضمرة أنس بن عياض ويحيى بن سعيد الأموي كلاهما عن عبيد الله بن عمر أخرجه أبو عوانة في صحيحه من طريقهما لكن قرن كل منهما نافعا بعبد الله ibn Dinar. Can you see? So he's mentioning that, like how Abdullah ibn Dinar is narrating it from Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu an, Nafi also narrated it from Abdullah ibn Umar. But for those of you who are studying Nuzha an-Naḍar for the first time, don't worry about this point. For those of you who are studying it for the second point, you can see that here he's mentioning it as an example of al-Fard al-Muṭlaq, but there he mentioned support for it. Nevertheless, Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah thereafter affirmed again, وَتَفَرَّدَ عَبْدُ ibn Dinar بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ. On a side note, you remember we discussed the claims of Allama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah under the chapter of Aziz. So it was a few lessons back. What was it? Lesson 21. So Allama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah, he claimed that Imam Bukhari rahimahullah stipulated that a narration has to be Aziz, then only he would narrate it in his Sahih. And then Allama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah, he answered an objection which could be raised against him. And that is the first narration, that if someone is to say that the first narration is not even Aziz, and you are saying that this was the condition of Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, then Ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah, he gave the response, but we gave the counter response to that. So although his response was incorrect, even if we had to accept the response that he gave for the first narration, this narration that is also transmitted by Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, this here is not Aziz, because this here is Gharib. And therefore, Allama Iraqi rahimahullah, he mentioned in his Nukat on Muqaddamah ibn Salah, التقييد والإيضاح, وإذ قد اعترض عليه في حديث عمر هذا فهل اعترض عليه في الحديث الذي بعده فقد ذكر المصنف أنه أوضح في التفرد من حديث عمر وهو حديث عبد الله بن دينار عن عبد وهو حديث عبد الله بن دينار عن ابن عمر في النهي عن بيع الولاء وعن هبته. That this narration here will also go against the claim of Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah. So nevertheless, that is the first example that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah presented. He then says, وَقَدْ يَنْفَرِدُ بِهِ رَاوٍ عَنْ ذَلِكَ الْمُنْفَرِدِ. That sometimes you can have just one person who is quoting from that individual tabi'i. So he gives the example كحديث شعب الإيمان, like the hadith of شعب الإيمان. I'll explain it now. تفرد به أبو صالح عن أبي هريرة. It is only Abu Salih who is narrating it from Abu Huraira. So by this point it is now becomes al-Fard al-Muṭlaq, because you have the one tabi'i. وتفرد به عبد الله بن دينار عن أبي صالح. Again you can see the same narrator Abdullah ibn Dinar. He's the only one who is transmitting it from Abu Salih. So this narration of Shu'ab al-Iman is again a narration of Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. They both narrate what their chains which links up to Abdullah ibn Dinar. عن عبد الله بن دينار عن أبي صالح عن أبي هريرة. So Abdullah ibn Dinar is the only person who is narrating it from Abu Salih, and Abu Salih is the only person who is narrating it from Abu Huraira. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الإيمان بضع وسبعون شعبة. That is the narration of Shu'ab al-Iman, that there are 69 parts of Iman. And then after he speaks about Haya. So after presenting these two examples, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimullah said, وَقَدْ يَسْتَمِرُّ التَّفَرُّدُ فِي جَمِيعِ رُوَّاتِهِ أَوْ أَكْثَرِهِم. That now you can even have tafarrud, you can have the singularity in the lower link. So you can have it in majority of the sanad, or even in the entire sanad. وَقَدْ يَسْتَمِرُّ التَّفَرُّدُ فِي جَمِيعِ رُوَّاتِهِ أَوْ أَكْثَرِهِم. Sometimes the singularity continues in every link. The link of each and every link of the sanad, أو أكثرهم, or the majority of the chain. So it does not matter what happens after the link of the tabi'in. We only focus on the link of the tabi'in. If there is only one tabi'i, the narration is al-Fard al-Muṭlaq. You remember in the previous lesson we quoted the explanation that the author gave. Alama Qasim ibn Qutlubugha rahimahullah, he quoted that قال المصنف إن روى عن الصحابي تابعي واحد فهو الفرد المطلق سواء استمر التفرد أم لا بأن رواه عنه جماعة. So we explained that as long as we only have a single tabi'i, the narration will be al-Fard al-Muṭlaq. It now does not matter how many narrators there are in the other links. So once there is only one tabi'i quoting the narration, then irrespective whether there is only one narrator in the next link, and one narrator in the link thereafter, and one narrator in the link which comes after that, or whether there are multiple narrators, the narration will continue to be al-Fard al-Muṭlaq. Now one point to mention here, just for your interest, so mention it in passing, that the vast majority of gharib narrations that you get, they are generally al-Fard al-Muṭlaq. Now we mentioned that other scholars, they use this term differently. The scholars before Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, they did not use it according to the definition that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is presenting here. So we mentioned that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he is the one who specified and confined the meaning of al-Fard al-Muṭlaq to a single narrator in a specific part of the chain, that is the link of the tabi'in. Before him, Alama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he defined the term more broadly. So there's a whole chapter in Muqaddamah ibn Salah on page 88. Very briefly he mentioned there, الأفراد منقسمة إلى ما هو فرد مطلقا وإلى ما هو فرد بالنسبة إلى جهة خاصة. And then he explained الفرد المطلق. أما الأول فهو ما ينفرد به راو عن كل واحد. Can you see how he's explaining it? وقد سبقت أقسامه وأحكامه قريبا. That way you have one person quoting from one person, this is what is called الفرد المطلق. So you can see that Alama ibn Salah rahimahullah is not claiming that there has to be a single tabi'i. And then besides this, Alama ibn Salah rahimahullah, he also used the term Fard Mutlaq to mean that there is contradiction between one student and others. And therefore, Shaykh Nuruddin Itr, he said, وَيَدْخُلُ فِيهِ أَيْضًا الشَّاذ وَالْمُنْكَرُ. So ashad and munkar, these are terminologies which shall come ahead. But basically for now, I just understand that there is contradiction. So if there is contradiction, there can be multiple narrators. But if one narrator is contradicting all how his colleagues transmitted it, how all the others transmitted it from his same sheikh, then this will also be called al-fardul mutlaq. So this is how ulama Ibn Salah rahimahullah used the term. Before ulama Ibn Salah rahimahullah, we do not find any earlier scholars using the term al-fardul mutlaq. So earlier scholars, they simply used the term al-fard. And they would also use the words gharib sanadan wa matnan. So this is what they would say. If you look in the footnotes, you can see Shaykh Nuruddin Attar, he writes that the muhaddithin, they would also refer to fard mutlaq as gharib sanadan wa matnan. Ulama Ibn Salah rahimahullah, he explained gharib sanadan wa matnan is وَهُوَ الَّذِي تَفَرَّدَ بِرِوَايَةِ مَتْنِهِ rawin wahid. This here is on page 271. Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he also used this term in a different way in another book of his. So although he's specifying the meaning of al-gharib al-mutlaqiyah in his nukat of Muqaddamah Ibn Salah, he explained fard mutlaq in a much broader way. There he wrote, وغاية ما في الباب أن المطلق ينقسم إلى نوعين أحدهما تفرد شخص من رواة الحديث or تفرد شخص من الرواة بالحديث. I think that's how he mentioned it. That if you have only one person, one narrator who is quoting it. So now he's not confining it to any link. And then he says والثاني تفرد أهل البلد بالحديث دون غيرهم والأول ينقسم أيضا إلى نوعين أحدهما يفيد كون المنفرد ثقة والثاني لا يفيد. So this here is in his nukat on volume 3 on page 155. So you can see that there is no mention of the link in which the single narrator is to be found. Now, although earlier scholars did not use this term, we can apply the term al-fardul mutlaq on other statements of theirs. You understand what I'm trying to say? That they did not use the words al-fardul mutlaq. They used some other words. When we are quoting those words, if you want to make riwayah bil ma'na, or we want to paraphrase what they said, then we can say that they said al-fardul mutlaq. So we can use the words al-fardul mutlaq when we find earlier scholars using some other words. And what are these words? So when they mention words like lam yarwi hadha al-hadith an, and they take the name of a sahabi, illa, that means except the tabi'i. So this is very common. Lam yarwi hadha al-hadith an Abi Hurairah illa, and then they'll take the name of a tabi'i. So then we can say that according to that scholar, this narration is al-fardul mutlaq. Likewise, if they say لا نعرفه إلا من حديثي, and they take the name of a tabi'i, and if they use similar words like this, then we can say that according to them the narration is al-fardul mutlaq. Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he now mentions the sources of al-fardul mutlaq. That in which books can you find al-fardul mutlaq? Where can you find narrations where there is only one tabi'i who is narrating from the sahabi? So he says, وفي مسند البزار والمعجم الأوسط للطبراني أمثلة كثيرة لذلك. That in the Musnad Bazzar and in Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat of Imam Tabarani, there are many examples of al-fardul mutlaq. So Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he makes specific mention of these two books, Musnad Bazzar and Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat. Why he makes specific mention about these two books? Because there's lots of al-fardul mutlaq narrations that could be found in these two books. So the first book that he mentions is Musnad al-Bazzar. This book is also known as Al-Bahr al-Zakhar. The author is Abu Bakr Ahmad ibn Amr al-Bazzar al-Ataki rahimahullah, and he passed away in the year 292 Hijri. So Alama Bazzar's whole objective was to point out the hidden defects in the narration. And therefore he mentions a narration and then he explains the defect. Alama Khatib rahimahullah, he mentions in Tarikh Baghdad in volume 4 on page 334, كان ثقة حافظا, that the author was a reliable person, he was a hafiz, he knew lots of ahadith of by heart. صنف المسند, he wrote the musnad, وتكلم على الأحاديث وبين عللها, he spoke about the ahadith. That means he clarified the errors and weakness in the narrations. وَبَيَّنَ عِلَلَهَا, and even when there were hidden defects, he explained and pointed out to those defects. Allama ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he said, يقع في مسند الحافظ من أبي بكر البزار من التعاليل ما لا يوجد في غيره من المسانيد. He mentions this in his اختصار علوم الحديث on page 47, the print which is printed with الباعث الحثيث, that يقع في مسند الحافظ من أبي بكر البزار من التعاليل, that he will explain to you the hidden defects ما لا يوجد في غيره من المسانيد, that he mentions those narrations with the hidden defects which others have not narrated. So like we said, that many times Allama Bazar, he points out to the weakness in the sanad. Now this book, portion of it is printed. It was printed by Maktaba al-Ulum wal-Hikam, and although it's not complete, it took 3 editors 21 years to print the kitab. So the one Sheikh Mahfuz al-Rahman Zainullah, he started to edit it in the year 1988. But then he passed away 9 years later, I think in 1997. And by this time he completed 9 volumes of the kitab. So then another sheikh by the name of Adil ibn Sa'd, he took over. And he completed until the 17th volume. And then Sabri Abdul Khaliq, he worked on the 18th volume. So you can imagine that the book is not complete, but it is in 18 volumes. That already shows you the knowledge of this scholar of Allama Bazar rahimahullah. Then Darul Kutub al-Ilmiya, they also published it, and it's in 20 volumes. And Darul Ḥadīth, they also published it in 10 volumes with a tahqiq of Sayyid Imran. So that's regarding the first book, Musnad Bazar. Then the second book is Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat. This book was written by Imam Abu al-Qasim Sulaiman ibn Ahmad ibn Ayyub at-Tabarani. Now if you remember, we spoke about him in the beginning. Can any of you remember what we said about Allama Tabarani rahimahullah? That we mentioned regarding his date of birth and his date of demise. So you remember that we spoke about Allama Rama Hurmuzi rahimahullah, that he was from amongst the first to write on Ulum al-Hadith. And we mentioned that he was born in the year 260 Hijri and he passed away in the year 360 Hijri. That means he lived for a complete century. And we mentioned that another scholar, and that was Allama Tabarani rahimahullah, he was also born in the same year 260 Hijri, and he also passed away in the same year in 360 Hijri. So Allama Tabarani rahimahullah, he wrote 3 ma'ajim. Now what is a mu'jam? So a mu'jam is a book where the author gathers the narrations of his teachers in an alphabetical order. So the 3 ma'ajim are Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, and then Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat, and Al-Mu'jam al-Saghir. Now here Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he only mentions about Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat. That Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat is a place where you can find many gharib narrations, or many narrations which are al-Fardul Mutlaq. However, his student Allama Sakhawi rahimahullah, he mentions Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat and Al-Mu'jam al-Saghir. Both of these books are sources for gharib narrations in Fath al-Mughith, volume 2, page 45. Wal-Mu'jaman al-Awsat was-Saghir lit-Tabarani. Then Allama Suyuti rahimahullah, he added the 3rd Mu'jam as well, and he claimed that all 3 ma'ajim, Saghir, Awsat and Kabir, all of these 3 ma'ajim are sufficient places to find enough gharib narrations. وفي معاجم الطبراني الثلاثة أمثلة كثيرة لذلك. This is in Tadrib al-Rawi. So the reason why Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is mentioning about Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat, because he's speaking specifically of Al-Fardul Mutlaq, and because Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat is a much greater source. Because Imam Tabarani rahimahullah, his very objective was to bring forth the gharaib of his teachers. So Allama Dhahabi rahimahullah, he mentioned in Tadhkiratul Huffaz in volume 3 on page 85, وصنف المعجم الكبير. Allama Tabarani wrote المعجم الكبير وهو المسند سوى مسند أبي هريرة. فَكَأَنَّهُ أَفْرَدَهُ فِي مُصَنَّف, that he gathers all the narrations of Sahaba, but he doesn't bring the narrations of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anh. Then he mentions about Al-Mu'jam Al-Awsat. وَالْمُعْجَمُ الْأَوْسَطِ في 6 مجلدات كبار على معجم شيوخه يأتي فيه عن كل شيخ بما له من الغرائب والعجائب. Can you see? So this here is what he is mentioning, that he brings the gharaib, he brings those narrations which his teachers mentioned and which are gharib. There are around 9,500 narrations in Al-Mu'jam Al-Awsat, and most of them are gharib mutlaq. Imam Tabarani rahimahullah, he would call this book his soul. Allama Dhahabi rahimahullah said that وَكَانَ يَقول هذا الكتاب روحي, that this kitab is my soul. Why? فإنه تعب عليه, that he really dedicated himself to it, he, like, exerted himself. وفيه كل نفيس وعزيز ومنكر. Sheikh Mahmud Tahan, he edited around a quarter of this book, and it was published by Maktabatul Ma'arif in 1407, but this copy of his is not very good. Then Sheikh Tariq ibn Iwadullah, he edited the book, and it was published by Darul Haramain in Cairo in 1415, and this here is a much better print. Now, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he mentioned these two books as sources for gharib narrations. But he did not mention a book that is superior to these two books. And which book is that? It is Al-Gharaib wal-Afrad lid-Darqutni. So this book of Imam Darqutni rahimahullah, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah did not mention about it here in Nuzha, but he mentioned it as a source in his Nukat. So he said, ثم الدارقطني في كتاب الأفراد وهو ينبئ على اطلاع بالغ. That once you see this book, you will understand the expertise of Imam Darqutni rahimahullah. So the reason why this book is much greater than the books of Imam Bazzar. Now we spoke about the knowledge of Imam Bazzar rahimahullah, 18 volumes, and it's still not even complete. And then Imam Tabarani rahimahullah, such a great muhaddith. But Imam Darqutni rahimahullah was a greater expert in detecting the hidden defects. So Allama Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he mentions that this book was in 100 parts. وللحافظ الدارقطني كتاب في الأفراد في 100 جزء لم يسبق إلى نذيره. Now here you might be thinking that okay, Hafiz ibn Hajar is speaking about the sources of Al-Fard al-Muṭlaq, and I'm mentioning to you books which are just on Afrad. So if you recall, I mentioned in passing that majority of Gharaib are Al-Fard al-Muṭlaq, isn't it? So therefore, when you say that there are lots of gharaib in this particular book, what does it mean? Automatically it will mean that there are many narrations that are Radul Mutlaq, if that's how you want to say it, or to make it easy, Al-Fardul Mutlaq. So Imam Ibn Kathir rahimahullah said, وَلِلْحَافِظِ الدَّارْقُطْنِي كِتَابٌ فِي الْأَفْرَادِ فِي 100 جُزْءٍ لَمْ يُسْبَقْ إِلَى نَذِيرِهِ. It's in 100 ajza, and no one has written a book like this here. But unfortunately, only 5 portions of this book has been printed. So from 100, only 5%. So there were a few manuscripts in Al-Maktabatul Zahiriya in Damascus. However, majority of the book, like 95% of the book, is probably mafqood. So that means it's not published, and no manuscript of it can be found. But then Allama Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he said, وَقَدْ جَمَعَهُ الْحَافِظ مُحَمَّد بن طاهر في أطراف رتبه فيها. So Ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi rahimahullah, he reorganized the entire book and he named it Atraful Gharaib wal Afrad. This year obviously was before the manuscripts were lost, so he had access to the whole book. So this book of his, Atraful Gharaib wal Afrad, this is published by Dar Kutub al-Ilmiyah. It was published in 1998 and it is in 5 volumes. So there are over 8,000 narrations which are in this book. One point to conclude and that is the fact that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is mentioning that Musnad al-Bazzar and Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat, and in another book of his he's mentioning the book of Imam Dar Qutni rahimahullah. The fact that he's mentioning these books as sources of gharib narrations, that does not mean that there are no gharaib or there are no narrations that are fardul mutlaq within the Sihah Sittah. So within the Sihah Sittah, you can see the two examples which he is given from where they are. Both examples are not only from the Sihah Sittah, they are from Sahihain, they are from Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, you are going to find narrations that are al-Fardul Mutlaq, and even in the other books, especially Jami' al-Tirmidhi, Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah, he narrated numerous narrations that are al-Fardul Mutlaq. Inshallah, in the next session, we'll speak about the next type of gharib narrations, and that is al-fardun an-nisbi. So until then, jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.